Charlie Kirk's assassination was good for Israel. So was the assassination of JFK, as I have explored in a recent episode. I know that's a controversial statement, but what unites these two deaths is that in both cases, men were removed who went against the very interest of Israel at precisely the wrong moment. Kennedy resisted Israel's drive for a nuclear bomb, and he did this by pressing Ben-Gurion and then his successor Levi Eshkol to open Dimona, that's Israel's nuclear reactor, to inspections. He did this at a time when Israel feared losing its deterrent window against its Arab neighbors. For Tel Aviv, Kennedy's defiance came at the worst possible time. And Kirk? He defied Netanyahu just as the Gaza genocide had shattered Israel's moral standing, just as Republican youth were beginning to peel away from unconditional support, and just as Netanyahu was pushing Trump towards a catastrophic war with Iran. Kirk's rebellion flared up at the precise moment when Israel needed total discipline inside the US conservative movement. But instead, Kirk lit a fuse that could have sparked an explosion to which a Dimona accident would look like fireworks. In both cases, the timing was intolerable. Kennedy and Kirk weren't just dissenters, they were dissenters at the very moment Israel could least afford them. And in both cases, their sudden death cleared an obstacle that allowed Israel's agenda to proceed unchallenged. That's the threat nobody in Washington will admit. That's the forbidden history. When Israel faces an existential pressure point, inconvenient men have a way of disappearing. Now let's not romanticize Charlie Kirk's rise. He wasn't some grassroots kid who hustled his way into the conservative big leagues. Nope, Charlie Kirk was manufactured. He was funded, hand-selected to play a very specific role. And at the center of this role, Israel. From the early days on, Turning Point USA, the organization Kirk built, Kirk was plugged into the Zionist donor pipeline. Money funneled through outfits like the David Horowitz Freedom Center. That wasn't charity, it was investment, a down payment on future influence. The rules were brutally simple. Kirk could scream about anything he wanted. Immigration, race, abortion, whatever. He could stoke the culture war flames, drag campuses into endless battles over speech. But on one subject there was no room for improvisation. Again, Israel. Supporting Israel wasn't just an item on the checklist. It was the ticket to power. And Kirk, he played his part to the hilt. He became a megaphone for the Judeo-Christian myth, parroting that America's roots were inseparable from Israel's destiny. He went on offense against the BDS movement, smearing students and professors who dared to push for boycott or divestment. And here's my first observation. Kirk didn't just defend Israel, he became an enforcer. His network worked hand in glove with blacklisting projects like Canary Mission. I might even make an episode about them. Let's remember what that meant. Students and professors, not always Palestinian or Muslim, had their names plastered online as terrorist sympathizers. Their job prospects tanked, their visas were threatened. People lost careers, lost futures, lost livelihoods. And Kirk wasn't on the sidelines. He was part of that very ecosystem, smiling as lives were wrecked. Why? Because that was the Faustian bargain. Israel doesn't just want cheerleaders, it wants attack dogs, pit bulls. And Kirk, young, energetic, baby-faced, was perfect. He could go on campus, rile up students, and carry out a crusade that merged conservative grievances with unconditional Zionism. And one has to say and recognize the rewards were immense. Turning Point ballooned into the biggest conservative youth machinery in history. His budget climbed towards $80 million at its peak. He had private security, the former Navy SEALs, Special Forces type, guarding his events like he already was running for president, which he might have. None of that happened without deep-pocketed billionaires, of course. And those billionaires, they weren't just generic right-wingers. They were heavily tied to Israel, to the very donors who have been dictating US foreign policy for decades. And this, my friends, this was the Kirk brand. Firebrand nationalism on the surface, but under the hood, bought and paid for by Zionist money. And of course I can imagine that must have been irking Kirk, because he knew it. He wasn't dumb. He knew where the money came from. He knew the leash he was on. And for years he accepted it. He played the role. But, and this is what made his rebellion so dangerous, when you build your empire on that bargain, breaking it isn't just disloyal. It's betrayal. The kind of betrayal that the donor class, the Israeli lobby, and Netanyahu himself would never forgive. Because the deal was clear from day one. Support Israel or lose everything. Now if there was ever a moment Charlie Kirks signed his own death warrant, it wasn't in some shady back room. It was on stage in front of thousands of young conservatives at his Student Action Summit in Tempe. It was supposed to be just another pep rally for Turning Point USA. Lights, music, red meat speeches about woke mobs and border walls. But instead it turned into something completely different. Something terrifying for the Israel lobby. Because in Tempe, Charlie Kirk broke the deal. First, he invited Tucker Carlson on stage. That alone was a signal. Tucker had already drifted away from lockstep support for Israel. But what happened next? Tucker didn't just criticize Israel policy, he went nuclear. He suggested that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a creep with connections, he was possibly a Mossad asset. That's right, Epstein, the convicted sex trafficker with ties to presidents, billionaires and intelligence circles, was floated as an Israeli operative. As outlandish as this seems at first, the whole Epstein saga makes much more sense if viewed through this lens. And Kirk just stood there letting it happen, even nodding along. If you understand the ecosystem, you know how radioactive that was. The Epstein-Mossad connection is the ultimate taboo. It's the kind of claim that sends shivers through the donor class because it suggests not only that Israel runs influence operations in America, but that one of the biggest scandals in modern history might have been one of them. And Kirk gave it oxygen. Then, of course, came the second bombshell. Kirk mocked Bill Ackman. Bill, of course, is one of Netanyahu's most powerful US billionaires, a man who had used his money to topple Harvard's president Claudine Gay and bully institutions into compliance. Kirk not only called him a financial scam artist, he questioned where his money came from. So this wasn't just a casual jab. This was public humiliation of a donor cutout, a man whose billions were a direct extension of Netanyahu's power in America. And the crowd, they loved it. They cheered. They delighted in watching a Zionist kingmaker get dragged through the mud, to put it mildly. And then Kirk took it even further. He opened the floor to a live debate on Zionism itself. He brought on Dave Smith, an anti-Zionist Jewish comedian who faced off against Joshua Hammer, a pro-Israeli apparatchik from Newsweek. And what happened? Smith annihilated him. He exposed Israel's human rights abuses, dismantled the talking points, and the crowd was right there with him. Thousands of young conservatives roaring in support of anti-Zionism at a Turning Point event. So that night in Tempe, the mask slipped. Kirk wasn't just flirting with dissent, he was staging a rebellion. And he was giving a platform to voices the lobby had spent decades and billions silencing. and the grassroots responded with enthusiasm. For Israel's backers on the other side, of course, this was a nightmare scenario. The golden boy was turning, and worse, he was taking the base with him. So think about how it looked from the other side. A man that bankrolled, protected, and elevated for years had just hosted Epstein-Mossad speculations on stage, publicly mocked Bill Ackman, Netanyahu's financial enforcer, and unleashed an anti-Zionist Jew to mop the floor with the Zionist in front of thousands of conservatives. That was a full-fledged mutiny. And the donors, the lobby, Netanyahu, they weren't going to let it slide. Because Tempe was a declaration. Charlie Kirk was no longer theirs. And in this world, when you break that kind of deal, when you embarrass them in public, the consequences are never small. Consequently, and not surprising, what happened after Tempe wasn't just a pushback. It wasn't a polite, "Hey Charlie, maybe tone it down." No, what came next was raw intimidation. The kind of thing that reminds you that politics at this level isn't about debate, it's about pure, naked power. Kirk's phone virtually blew up after that summit. Donors, the very men who had written the checks that built Turning Point, were calling him out, hammered him with texts, and the message was unmistakable. We built you, we can take it all away. That's not meant as a figure of speech, that's mob talk. And that's exactly how it landed on Kirk. According to friends close to him, he was shaken. He wasn't just annoyed, he was frightened. For years he had been the golden child of these billionaires. Now, suddenly, they were treating him like a property, like a disobedient asset that needed to be brought to heel. And then the ante got raised. Because into this storm walked no other than Netanyahu himself. Think about that. A sitting Israeli prime minister in the middle of a multi-front war, juggling crises from Gaza to Lebanon to Iran, takes time to personally intervene in the finances of a conservative youth organization in the United States. That alone should stop you cold. What does it tell us? Think about it. It tells us that Netanyahu knew exactly how dangerous Kirk's rebellion was. That if Turning Point cracked, if the conservative youth base flipped on Israel, the whole foundation of bipartisan US support could start to shake. So Netanyahu makes his move. He comes in with an offer to re-up Turning Point's budget with a fresh infusion of Zionist cash. We're not talking about pocket change, we're talking tens of millions of dollars, which, by the way, most likely would have come from the US anyway. It would have been enough money to keep Kirk's machine humming, enough to fund the flashy summits, the security teams made up of ex-Navy SEALs, the whole presidential-level stagecraft he was building. And the deal was simple. Come back to the fold. Stop talking about Israel. Stop feeding their rebellion. Do this and we'll make sure you're untouchable. But Kirk, and this is where the tragedy sharpens, Kirk said no. He refused. Friends who spoke to him in those final weeks described him as cold, anxious, and even frightened. He knew what he had done. Of course he is frightened. He knew what it meant to defy the lobby. He knew what it meant to turn down Netanyahu's personal offer. So it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Because here's something he could have known from the beginning. When you're inside that machine, you don't get to live on your own terms. Surprise. You don't get to say, thanks for the money, thanks for the funding, thanks for the support, but now I'm going my own way. That's not how it works. How naive can you be? And when you take the money, you take their leash. And when you try to rip it off, it's then when you find out just how tight it can get. So for Kirk, Tempe was the spark. The donor mafia's threats, they were just a warning shot. And Netanyahu's personal intervention was the final ultimatum. And when he refused, when he dared to say no to the man who can ban American presidents, that was the moment his days were numbered. The United States is supposed to be the most powerful country on earth. But when you peel back the curtain, you see something grotesque. Israeli intelligence treating Washington like its own playground. They're planting bugs everywhere, running surveillance, humiliating world leaders, and getting away with it. Multiple sources told Max Blumenthal that during Netanyahu's visit to Washington in Trump's second term, Israeli agents planted surveillance devices, electronic surveillance gear, on US Secret Service vehicles. I mean, you really can't make this thing up. The Prime Minister of Israel visits America, and his team wires up the very cars tasked with protecting the US president. No, this isn't rumor, and it doesn't come from internet chatter either. Politico already reported back in 2019 that Israel had planted stingray devices around the White House to spy on Trump's cell phone calls. 3 former US officials confirmed it. That was years ago. If they were doing it then, why wouldn't they do it now? And it's not just America either. Boris Johnson's own memoirs include an astonishing detail. Netanyahu used Johnson's private bathroom, and afterwards Johnson's security team found a listening device hidden in the toilet. In the toilet. Tony Blair, years earlier, had warned his team never to discuss sensitive government matters inside Israeli buildings or cars, because they were almost certainly bugged. This is worse than in the former Soviet Union. That is the environment Netanyahu created. Even allies, even supposed friends, expect to be spied on, monitored, compromised. And Washington knew. Trump's White House knew. And according to sources, it made Trump himself nervous. Very nervous. Again, according to Max Blumenthal, people close to Trump described him as frightened to defy Netanyahu. He knew what could happen if he crossed the line. He knew what kind of compromise Israel might have. He knew Netanyahu had the will and the means to bring him down if necessary. So ask yourself, if the President of the United States was afraid of Netanyahu, what chance did Charlie Kirk have? A political upstart funded by Zionist billionaires suddenly thinking he could break free. This is where it got really dangerous for Kirk, because Kirk wasn't just defying donors. He was defying a foreign power that had already humiliated American and European leaders, bugged their phones, planted devices in their toilets, and made it clear that it would do whatever it takes to keep control. And remember, this wasn't just about loyalty, it was about timing. Netanyahu is in the middle of a 7-front war. He believes that he has a narrow window to crush Gaza, to break Hezbollah, and, most dangerously, to push Trump into a regime change in Iran. If Kirk succeeded in peeling the conservative base away from Israel, that whole house of cards could collapse. That made Kirk more than just a nuisance. It made him a threat. A threat not just to donor money, but to Israel's war strategy itself. And in that kind of environment, when you have already shown you are willing to bug the White House, when you have already proven you can intimidate American presidents, what's one more inconvenient man to neutralize? And let's not forget, of course, Israel's government plans and executes political assassinations for living. This is why Trump's fear matters, because it shows the scale of the pressure. It wasn't just billionaires wagging their fingers. It was a whole intelligence state looming over the room. Kirk stepped into that storm when he said no. And in the end, he didn't just find himself alone, he found himself exposed. So I argue that Charlie Kirk didn't die in some chaotic brawl or from a random gun nut with a grudge. He died by sniper fire, a clean shot to the neck, cold, precise, clinical. And that's important because it sets the tone. This wasn't messy, it wasn't random, it was surgical. And almost before his body hit the ground, their scramble to control the narrative had begun. Who was fastest to the keyboard? Right, Netanyahu. The very same Netanyahu Kirk had just mocked, defied, and rejected. Suddenly, and only 20 minutes after the shot, and I've discussed what this implies on my Substack. Just 20 minutes after the shot, Netanyahu was already over Twitter, posting again and again, calling Kirk a true friend of Israel. A man who, according to those closest to him, despised Netanyahu by the end. Who thought he was a disgusting bully, a manipulator, someone who treated him like property. But that didn't matter. What mattered was branding, rewriting, claiming him before the truth could sink in. And then the media enforcers went to work. Ben Shapiro, Netanyahu's most valuable mouthpiece in the US, jumped in. So did Mark Levin. Both had been openly hostile to Kirk in the days before his death, ridiculing him for giving Tucker Carlson a stage, sneering that you can't have a big tent if you let anti-Israel voices into the church. 4 days later, Kirk was shot, and within 24 hours, Shapiro was positioning himself to, and I quote, pick up the bloody microphone Kirk had dropped. Think about that phrasing. Shapiro did not say, mourn him. He didn't say, defend his right to free speech. But Shapiro grabbed the mic and promised that under his stewardship, dissent on Israel would never be tolerated again. And the subtext was crystal clear. Kirk's rebellion died with him. From there on, the movement would stay in line. Meanwhile, Netanyahu doubled down on the branding. Tweet after tweet, statement after statement, trying to cement the idea that Kirk had been on his side all along. We called it overcompensating, almost desperate, because he knew the truth. Kirk had turned. Kirk had despised him. And if that truth spread, it could have infected the entire conservative youth movement. Better to bury it under a mountain of posthumous flattery. And this is where Netanyahu's sinister genius comes in. Because alive, Kirk was dangerous. He was pulling the base away from Israel. Dead, on the other hand, he could be sanitized, rebranded, turned into a mother for the very cause he had begun to resist. And the machinery moved fast, faster than facts, faster than investigations. Before we even knew who the shooter really was, before we had any clarity on motive, the message was already locked in. Kirk was a friend of Israel, and anyone who said otherwise, anyone who dared to minimize his death, was an enemy of order, of America, of God's chosen alliance. That's the trick of narrative seizure. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters who tells the story first. And Netanyahu, Shapiro, Levin, they told it with ruthless efficiency. So by the time people even started whispering about Kirk's anti-Zionist turn, it was too late. The brand had been recaptured, the rebellion smothered. Charlie Kirk in life was a liability. Charlie Kirk in death was an asset. And for Israel, that was the only outcome that mattered. So Charlie Kirk wasn't even in ground before his name was carved into law. That's how fast the machine moved. Representative Brian Mast, a former IDF soldier, let's not forget, how this is possible is another matter altogether, immediately introduced a bill authorizing the State Department to revoke the passports of so-called terrorist sympathizers. What does it mean? In practice, it means anyone who criticizes Israel. Under the language of the bill, providing material support to America's enemies. It even could be as vague as offering legal advice to a Palestinian group, sharing links online, of course, or standing on a stage at a protest. And best of all, no court oversight, no due process, sole discretion handed to the Secretary of State. And guess who controls who gets to be Secretary of State? Right, the same lobby that leaned on Kirk until his last breath. This is Israel's agenda, dressed up in red, white and blue. And then came the calls for a Charlie Kirk Act, a law named after the man who just began to rebel against the Zionist leash, now being used to cement that leash on anyone else. Online campaigns erupted, demanding that media accused of misinformation about Israel face censorship, even criminal penalties. The right, which had once railed against cancel culture, suddenly became its most vicious practitioner. Only this wasn't about getting people fired from jobs, it was about stripping citizenship, sending people into exile, erasing entire movements. My exposé on Substack shows you exactly how Charlie Kirk's death is utilized to implement the new authoritarian America. If you don't believe me, Stephen Miller, Trump's ideological hitman, made it plain on Fox News. "We will put you into exile," he said, "if you minimize Charlie Kirk's death. Not we'll debate you, not we'll prove you wrong. Exile, citizenship stripped, passports revoked, freedoms gone, all in the name of honoring Kirk." Do you see the grotesque irony? Kirk had finally begun to break ranks on Israel. He mocked Netanyahu's billionaire cutouts, hosted anti-Zionist voices, dared to say the unsayable. For that he was treated like a traitor by his own funders, pressured, threatened, ultimately silenced. And then his death was turned into pretext for a wave of repression designed to crush the very debate he had tried to start. Universities who already felt the heat, funding threatened, professors blacklisted, student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine painted as breeding grounds for terror. CNN, Reuters, even AP accused of collaborating with terrorists simply for publishing photographs from October the 7th. The agenda was clear: erase criticism of Israel from American life. And the most sinister part, they did it all draped in Kirk's memory. His name, his image, his blood leveraged to silence the very cause Kirk had started to represent. That's how you know this wasn't just opportunism. It was orchestration. It was a plan pulled off with ruthless speed. Because the assassination didn't just remove a critic. It gave Israel's lobby exactly what it needed. A mother they could rebrand as a weapon they could swing against the rest of us. Charlie Kirk alive was a problem. Charlie Kirk dead was a policy tool. And if you want to understand who benefited, look not at the sniper rifle but at the laws that followed. That's where the fingerprints really are. So what I'm saying is that you can't really understand the political fallout of Charlie Kirk's assassination without stepping back and seeing it in historical context. Because what happened here isn't new. It's part of an old playbook, the strategy of tension. I've written a multi-page exposé about this very strategy on my Substack. It contains timelines, names, sources and receipts and is well worth reading. The link's in the description. But to give you already a taste, think back to Italy in the 1970s. There were multiple European countries affected, but to make my point, I use Italy as an example. The 1970s were the so-called years of lead. A wave of bombings, assassinations, kidnappings. The public was told it was the work of left-wing anarchists and communists. But guess what? Decades later, what do we find? Many of those attacks were false flag operations, carried out by far-right groups recruited into, guess whom, NATO. Yes, they were recruited into NATO's stay-behind networks under Operation Gladio. I have interviewed Dr. Daniele Ganza, who wrote his PhD on Operation Gladio. The link is in the description. Their mission? Create fear. Keep the middle class terrified of communism and the left. Push society towards authoritarian security measures, all while keeping Italy locked into the Western Bloc. The most infamous case, at least in Italy, was Aldo Moro, at the time Italy's prime minister. Remember? Kidnapped by the Red Brigades, put on trial in a makeshift cell, then executed. Officially, it was leftist terrorism. But documents and testimonies since have clearly shown that the Red Brigades were riddled with infiltrators. It was shown that intelligence services, including Israeli, had a stake in eliminating Moro. Why? Because he allowed weapons to move quietly through Italy to groups Israel considered enemies. And because he was exploring a coalition that could have shifted Italian politics out of NATO's control. His death crushed that possibility. Now tell me, doesn't that sound familiar? I know Kirk wasn't Aldo Moro, but the pattern rhymes. A man at the center of the political system begins to shift. He challenges the sacred alliance with Israel. He opens space for debate. And suddenly he's gone. A bullet, a scapegoat, and a crackdown. The aftermath? Almost identical to Gladio's strategy of tension. Fear ramps up. Trump blames the left instantly. Muslims, immigrants, Antifa, all branded as culprits before any evidence. Bills get pushed through Congress, stripping away more and more rights. Universities are purged. Media outlets threatened. Dissenters labeled terrorists. Again, much more on this in my exposé on Substack. So this is exactly how tension is managed. Use violence to justify repression. Use the chaos of assassination to make the public accept measures they never would tolerate otherwise. And always direct the anger at the left, at minorities, at the vulnerable. Never at the real power players who actually benefit. I invite you, look at Israel's own record. Assassinations are a core instrument of policy. From Palestinian leaders in Beirut to Iranian scientists in Tehran, Israel has normalized targeted political killing as a tool. Thousands of pages detonated to assassinate low-level Hezbollah members and their families. Political enemies silenced abroad, allies bugged and humiliated. Even Boris Johnson's toilet. Remember, nothing is off limits. So when millions speculate about Israeli involvement in Kirk's death, they're not crazy. They're responding to a pattern. They are seeing how the fallout looks identical to past strategies. A threat neutralized, a rebellion crushed, a society nudged deeper and deeper into authoritarian control. And whether Israel pulled the trigger or not, the logic still holds. The strategy of tension is about who benefits, who gains from the fear, the crackdown, the silencing of debate. And once again, the answer is clear. Israel and its lobby walked away stronger after Kirk's death. Stronger in Washington, stronger in the Republican Party, stronger in their grip on the narrative. That's the strategy of tension in action. And Kirk's assassination fits like a glove. Let me end on the one question nobody dares to ask out loud. And remember, it's only a question. If Israel is willing to bug the White House, to humiliate Prime Minister, to blackmail the president of the ICC or ICJ, I forgot, topple university presidents, blacklist students, strip citizenship from Americans, not to mention the countless political assassinations they already have under their belt, why do we think they'd stop short of political assassination in the United States? Again, it's a question, and I know it sounds outlandish. This is the last taboo in Washington. Everyone whispers it, nobody says it out loud. Because once you say it, the whole edifice cracks. If Israel can reach into America and silence one of its own rising stars, then what sovereignty does the United States really have? Who's in charge? The people who vote or the people who pay? Look at the sequence. A man who defied Netanyahu's donors, who rejected Netanyahu's personal offer of millions, who mocked Israel's oligarchs in front of thousands, who gave anti-Zionist voices a stage in the heart of the conservative movement, and then a sniper's bullet and silence. The FBI investigation is a mess. The suspect isn't cooperating. The narrative is being spun faster than evidence can surface. And already, Kirk's death is being turned into law, weaponized to criminalize dissent. That's not coincidence, that's choreography. So the real scandal isn't just that Charlie Kirk is dead. The scandal is what his death reveals. That the line between America and Israel has blurred to the point of disappearance. That the foreign government can shape not only US policy, but US reality, deciding who gets to rise, who gets to fall, who gets to live, and who becomes more useful in death. That's the thought you're not supposed to have. That's the last taboo. And that's why, whether Israel fired the shot or not, Charlie Kirk's assassination will go down as a warning. A warning to every politician, every pundit, every activist who think they can challenge the Zionist leash and walk away unscathed. Because the truth is brutal. Once you take their money, once you step inside that machine, you're not free. Not at all. You have to realize that. And if you try to break out, you don't just risk your career, you risk everything. That's what Kirk learned in his final month. And that's what his assassination tells us now. If you made it that far, congratulations, you are ahead of the pack and nobody can take this away from you. Stay sharp, stay informed, and remember, always look beyond the headlines. Over and out.